Hi, my name is Kyle Folsom, and I will be demonstrating how to create a sales manager dashboard within Tableau. One of the growing challenges associated with the expansion of data analytics is how to present the information so that it is easy to understand and drives action throughout the organization. One of the largest areas of need is for the frontline employees that generate the revenue for the company. These employees' strengths typically are not within the analytical realm, and therefore they require extra attention in determining what information will be useful for them and how to present that data. So here's what the end product will look like when I'm done with the demonstration. Each of these representations have been selected to better assist a manager to deliver on their responsibilities. The way they do this is by identifying key performance indicators that need improvement, or identifying underperforming employees that need development, or also by seeing the earnings that they stand to gain and hopefully motivate them to generate more sales. I will spend time discussing how to create each of these representations, as well as how to make them dynamic based on the parameters that you see above. So something as simple as switching to March, you'll see each of the representations update based on that selection. I'd now like to spend more time explaining the first representation that I will be demonstrating, which is the speedometer. A manager's monthly compensation is calculated based on what my company calls a hurdle structure. What that means is the manager receives a flat rate based on all the revenue that their team generates for that month. And this rate increases with each threshold of revenue that the team achieves. So in this Excel file, it demonstrates what a manager's compensation plan will look like. So in this example, we have $254,000 in revenue, which hits hurdle 1. So this manager stands to make 0.5% on all of that revenue. However, if his team is able to increase their performance and hit $370,000 in revenue, then that manager stands to make 0.62% on all of that revenue. So one of the first things I'd like to do is go over the basics of the data. An important thing that you will need to do is identify how you are going to join the data in Tableau. So if we look at each of these tabs, what we'll notice is that we have employee ID on each of the 3 tabs. So employee ID is going to serve as our joining field. Now once you're in Tableau, you'll need to import the data based on the file type. So my file is an Excel file. I'll navigate to where the file is and then upload it. And for the sake of time, I'm going to move to a file that I've already uploaded the data. But once it's there, you will need to drag in the fields in the necessary order and then select the proper joins and type of join in order to create your data set as you see below. So once we've done the joins, now we're ready to move on to creating our first representation. So first, before we get started, I would like to go over the importance of creating a parameter rather than using filters. Parameters allow for multiple representations to be dynamic based on a single field. Tableau gives you the ability to filter on any field by simply dragging them into the filter selection, but these filters are only specific to the given sheet. So if we use filters, when we go to bring these representations into the dashboard, they will require their own selection in order to update. So not only will this make your dashboard unnecessarily busy, it will also be extremely inefficient to update. So we will need 2 parameters that will be used throughout this project: an employee name parameter and a month parameter. And as you can see at the bottom of the screen, I've already created these parameters, but I'd still like to demonstrate how you go about creating them. So for employee name parameter, I'm going to find that field and right click on it. And then under create, I have the option to select parameter. Now, for this employee parameter, I don't want the entire list of employees. This is a sales manager dashboard. So for the employee name, I only want the manager names to exist on this parameter. So there's a couple ways that you can do that. You can simply hit clear all and then type in each of those names, or you can find the X next to each of these names and just delete them out as you go until you get to the manager name. So I just want to go ahead and show the end result of this parameter. I have my employee parameter, and these are my 6 manager names. So now I'm going to move on to how we apply the parameters across all the representations. And the answer to that is by creating a calculated field that forces the representation to match the parameter. So I just want to kind of go through how this works. So I have my two parameters listed here with the name and the month, and now I need to create a calculated field that forces it to match my parameter. So I'm going to need a variety of calculated fields throughout this project, but for the sake of time, I'm only going to demonstrate how to create that one time. So the way you do that is by coming to Analysis, and then at the bottom, there is an option that says Create Calculated Field. So I can name my field in this box, which I will name Match Employee. And then the formula will go in the lower box, which works very similar to Excel. So this formula is pretty basic. It's just going to be employee parameter equals employee name. So now that I have that field, I can drag it into my filter section and select true. And you'll see that my employee list here will be narrowed down to a single person, which is John Cooper. So the way that I can kind of check that my filter is working, I can come down to employee parameter, right click on it, select show parameter control, and then I see I have John Cooper over here. So if I change it to Tony Dungy, for example, the representation now shows Tony Dungy. So the next thing I need to do is apply the same logic to the month. So I've already created the same formula for match month, and I'm going to drag it into the filters, select true, and now I have Tony Dungy in March. If I show my parameter control, I can see that March is selected, and if I change it, you'll also see it change over here. So this is how we're going to use throughout this project, is by using these match formulas to force the representation to match my parameter. Now, another important thing to remember is this is a manager dashboard. So the logic follows when the representation is for a manager statistic, I want my filter to be the match employee formula. However, when I'm doing a representation that shows statistics of all of the representatives that are underneath this manager, I will want to use the match manager formula rather than match employee. So now we're ready to begin creating the components of the speedometer. The speedometer will consist of two parts, the speedometer needle and then a background image that will be the actual image of the speedometer, which separates the 6 thresholds a manager can achieve. So first I want to start with the pieces needed for creating the needle, which is a line that has to be associated with the correct angle. This is a fairly complicated process to explain in Tableau, so I felt Excel was a better example. So first, to demonstrate, in order for the speedometer to accurately represent the hurdle achieved, it needs to be spread across the 0 to 180 degree spectrum. So I have to kind of go about a process of first identifying the percent achieved, if you will, of the hurdle. So if a manager has not hit any of the hurdles achieved, that meaning they hit hurdle 0, then they have hit 0% of the maximum hurdles they can achieve. And what I have to do is present these percentages as a percent of 180, right? So again, going back to it, hurdle 0 would give me an angle of 0, and the top hurdle would be anywhere between 150 and 180. So another issue with this is on the spectrum for coordinates, the 0 degree is on the right-hand side, right? And 180 degrees would be on the left-hand side of the spectrum. However, my speedometer works in the opposite direction, meaning hurdle 0, I need to be on the left-hand side, and it increase and go all the way over to hurdle 5 at 180 degrees. So the way that I get to the correct angle is by taking the inverse of the angle and subtracting that from 180. Now, what these three pieces equate to is now I can apply the cosine and sine formulas to actually get my coordinate points that I need for each hurdle. And now I'll move over to Tableau and kind of demonstrate how this creates a spectrum of points and then how we need to move on from there. So for each of the fields I just covered, I now have as calculated fields within Tableau, as you can see with the angle formula and my percent achieved formula. For this representation, I can actually remove my match month filter, and I'll explain that a little bit further in a second. And then the next thing I need to do is drag my X and Y coordinates into the rows and columns. So if you see here, I have two different versions of X and Y. I'll get into that in just a bit, but I'm going to use the example formulas for now. Move X into the columns and Y into the rows. And then as you can see, I have one data point. But if I go ahead and move month into the detail box, and change my month to actual month, you can see the spectrum of points that this representation creates. And each of these data points, as you can see, is a given month for the hurdle achieved for Tony Dungy. Now the problem with this representation is I'm only concerned with 1 month at a time. So I need to edit these formulas so that anything that doesn't match my month parameter will actually be forced to a central point at the bottom of the representation. So the way I do that, and I've already recreated that formula with my second version of X and Y, but the way I do that is with an if statement. So I'm maintaining the same formula that I use in Excel, but I'm adding an if statement that forces my month to equal my parameter. And if my month doesn't equal the parameter, then for X and Y, the coordinates will be 0, 0. So that's essentially forcing all the other points to shift to 0, 0 at the bottom of the graph. Now, the reason why I don't want that match month is if I do that, then all of my other points go away. I need those points to still exist so I can create the line of the needle. So if I go ahead and switch my formulas to the updated versions, you'll see a point at 0, 0 and a point for my actual month that's selected, which is June. So this is going to be the basis of my needle, and all I need to do is come over to the mark section, and instead of it being automatic, change it to line. And now we have our line that represents the needle of our speedometer. So the next thing we need to create is the background image that will represent our speedometer. So this can be done either in Excel or PowerPoint, whichever your preference, but the data set that we create needs to have 12 sections of equal value. And it's also important to mention that of those 12, 6 of them need to represent hurdles 0 through 5 so that we can use them as data labels in our representation. So we're going to highlight the values, go to Insert, select Charts, and select the donut chart. So the first thing I want to do is right-click and go to Select Data and make my horizontal axis labels equal to my hurdle labels. So you can see that changed at the bottom. We can get rid of this legend and then come to Data Labels, select More Options. On the last icon, we have Label Options. We need to change the value to category name and uncheck the leader lines. So now we can see we have hurdles 0 through 5, but they're in the wrong location. So we need to edit this chart, selecting the chart, and under Format Data Series, one of the options is to change the angle of the first slice. So the angle that we need for this example is 270 degrees. And that changes hurdle 0 from being on the very left all the way to hurdle 5 as our top half of our graph. So for the sake of time, I've already finished some of the other options we need to do. One of the more time-consuming ones is we need to hide the bottom half of the graph. So you can simply do that by just filling in each of the areas with a white fill and removing the data label, and that will give us essentially the speedometer that we're looking for. There's some other things that we can add to the visual quality of the speedometer by moving the data labels outside of the area and also filling in the colors with a palette that progressively becomes more intense as you approach higher hurdles. And the end result of this graph should look something along these lines. I use green just because I want to represent more green, more money with the higher hurdle that you achieve. So now we're going to move on to moving this image into Tableau, and I'll continue with that process next. So now we're back in Tableau, and before I go about bringing in the image, I want to review the X and Y coordinate formula. So at the beginning of each formula, this 2 represents the length of the line, which means that at any point, since we're fixated at 0, 0, the line will not reach past 2 in any direction. This is important when I bring in the image because it's going to ask me for the placement of the image, and I want to enter values that will be slightly above 2 so that the end of this needle will fall within that colored area of the speedometer. So the way to bring in the speedometer image is to go to Map, select Background Images, and then select the only option that will be there. Select Add Image, and then browse for the image within our folders. Once I hit Open, you can see it pops up in the window. And then, again, as I was saying, since the the needle itself will not be exceeding 2, I'm going to enter -2.5 and 2.5 as the left and right coordinates. Again, it's fixated at 0, so I'm going to leave the bottom at 0 and then change the top to 2.75. So when I bring in this image, it's extremely distorted and hard to see, but easiest way to fix this is to scroll out a little bit and then right-click on the x-axis, and we're going to fix this range to -3 and +3. So this gives a much better view of our speedometer, and now we'll move on to formatting and making this representation a lot more visually appealing. So the first thing we're going to do is increase the size of the needle. The reason for this is when this image gets placed on a dashboard amongst a variety of other representations, this needle is going to disappear. So we want it to stand out. So we're going to select the needle, come over to the marks area, select size, and then drag the slider over to the right. Another thing we can change is the color. I'm going to make it yellow. It's just a personal preference. I think it's going to stand out a little bit more by being a brighter color. And then some other house cleaning things we can do is to hide the axes. So right click on each axis and deselect show header. And then get rid of these dotted lines here by right clicking, select format, come over to the format lines, and this 0 lines on the drop down, select none. So this is a much cleaner view of the hurdle speedometer, and really you want the view to be as clean as possible because there's already a variety of information and representations on the dashboard, so cluttering it with other lines and numbers is just makes it harder to read and digest. So now our hurdle achieved speedometer is done. We can select the parameters and switch between the months to show how the needle moves with each month that is selected. One thing that you may notice is that the needle doesn't stay fixated to a specific point at each hurdle. In my example, I know I suggested that these would potentially be the only angles that were associated with each hurdle, but what I've done in the formulas is I've accounted for an additional factor. So what I want to be able to show is when someone is hitting hurdle 1, if they were toward the bottom of this range, I want them to be on the lower end of the hurdle 1 spectrum. And conversely, if they are approaching hurdle 2, then I want that needle to be on the upper end of hurdle 1. So I know we didn't cover that in the actual formula discussion, but it is built in so that it's a little bit more dynamic. So the next thing that we want to do is to create a data label that at the bottom of this shows the actual hurdle achieved, just to add to the fact, other than that it's pointing at the area 2 section. One way you can go about this is by using the data label functions within this representation, but what I've found is that there's a little more options and flexibility if you actually create its own worksheet and then bring that into the dashboard on its own. So what we're going to do is create a new tab. I've already labeled it here as Manager Hurdle Achieved, and this representation is fairly basic. We're going to move the match employee, select true into the filter, do the same for the match month, and then we're going to grab this hurdle achieved and drop it into this text option. Now you see the text returns a value of 24. That's because this function is on sum. We need to change this to attribute. And as you can see, we have hurdle 2. If I move back to the speedometer, the month of April for Tony Dungy is at hurdle 2. So those options should match up. Now, what we want to do is to format this a little bit further. So I can right click, select format, and in my fonts, I want to make the pane a little bit darker, make it bold, and also make it a larger font, let's say 36. And that's pretty much it for this visualization. This will now, when we go to the dashboard, this exact image will be brought underneath here and cover up the needle partially, just to give a little bit more of an appealing representation than just simply pointing at the hurdle 2 section. So the next representation that we will want to create is providing additional information to the managers that revolve around the hurdle achieved. So I'm going to move on to the Manager Hurdle Statistics tab, in which I've already set up most of the representation. Just as in the previous example, I have the match employee and match month equal to true. And then I've dragged this measure names into the columns and measure values into this text label. Now, I haven't found a good workaround for this particular representation, but what this does is it creates a long list of measure values, most of which we don't need for this representation. So I've just manually clicked on each of them and removed them if I don't need them, as well as dragging in any values that were excluded. And again, I had to change the function from measure sum to attribute for each of these numbers to prevent any duplication. So the next thing we want to do is to create, again, a stronger presentation. The numbers are fairly faint and we can summarize them a little better than they are now. Another thing we can do is to change the name of this label. So potential incremental bonuses is a very long name. We can make this a little bit better by right clicking on it, hitting edit alias, and I can change this to just say additional bonus. Now, these two fields were calculated fields. Basically, the additional volume is simply the difference between the volume that they've generated so far and the volume that they need to reach hurdle 3. And similarly, the additional bonus is the incremental bonus they stand to gain. So it calculates the bonus they would earn based on the minimum requirements to hit hurdle 3 and subtracts that from where they are expected to earn as of right now. So just to kind of review some of the formatting that I've applied to the Manager Hurdle Statistics. First, I changed the format of the numbers, which can be done by selecting any of the pills, selecting format, and changing the number format in this pane. Additionally, we can add some borders around and thicken the borders that were already existing by right-clicking and selecting format, moving over to the format borders, and the row divider is where I have thickened the line. There's some other formatting you can do, just like increasing the size as we've done in previous examples, and making the font bold just so that it's more visible when it's being combined with all of the other visualizations. So next we're going to move on to a manager earnings representation, and I'll go through the demonstration of how to create that. So on my manager earnings worksheet, I've already dropped in the filters for match employee to be true, but I also have a new filter for earning code description. And what I've done with this filter is I've focused this representation to only show the earnings related to manager functions. And that's important when you're looking at manager roles, because many times they fill in different roles depending on the shortage of the workforce. And I didn't want this representation to show any of those. Purely wanted to see what they're earning as a manager. So I had to create a calculated field for this representation, which was called year-to-date earnings. And essentially what this does is it takes the earnings under the month that is selected in the parameter and any months prior to that month to give you a total year-to-date number. So I'm going to take this calculated field and drop it into rows. And then I'm going to take the earning code description and drop it into color. You can see how this is segmented now between manager bonus, manager override, and manager TO. Additionally, I want to take the year-to-date earnings and drop it into the label so that we have data labels for our representation. Now, instead of showing earnings that are within the chart, I would rather show this as a percent of total. So by hitting the drop down, moving to quick table calculations, I can select percent of total and my labels update accordingly. Additionally, I can format those labels a little bit more by selecting format from the drop down, changing the number to percentage in 1 decimal place, and changing the font to white and bold for all the data labels. Another thing that I want to do is I want to remove this year-to-date earnings label. We're going to have titles for the representations for on the dashboard, so there's no reason to restate this as a access label. So one way to do that is to right-click on the axis, and on titles, simply delete out the title name, and your title will disappear. So just need to stretch this back out so that I can see the axis tick mark still, and wide enough to still see my data labels. And I can further format the axis by selecting format. On the axis pane, I can make the number follow the similar format for anytime we've referenced dollars, which is by making the $ and display it in thousands of units. And that pretty much sums up the manager earnings representation. What I'm going to move on to is some additional statistics that will supplement this graphic. So the two statistics that I wanted to include in this representation is the actual dollar amount associated with the year-to-date earnings. As we saw on the chart, yes, the bar chart does line up with this, but it doesn't specifically call it out. So I thought it would be useful to actually see that number. Another number that I thought would be useful is a new calculated field called annualized earnings. Essentially what it does is it takes this amount here and straight lines it for the remaining months of the year, giving you a total full year earnings that the manager is projected to earn. Now the setup of this representation is very similar to the manager hurdle statistics that we did, so I didn't want to reiterate the same thing. We have the manager employee to be true as we've done throughout, but again, it's important to note that the month is not within this representation because it involves multiple months. And again, I've formatted the numbers similar where they have the $ with 1 decimal place and in display units in thousands. And then just added a couple other formatting as you can see with changing the color to green and enlarging the numbers as I've done in other examples. And just to kind of reiterate one more time, if you want to change these numbers, you hit the drop down format. You can change the number, you can come to font, change the size of the font and the color of the font, and pretty much anything that you need to do for this textual based representation. So the next representation will be our first employee focused graphic. And it's important to note that I have replaced the match employee with the match manager because of this aspect. I'm also using my match month as I've done in other representations. The first thing I'm going to do is drag employee name into the rows, and you'll see that it will only list the employees that are under the manager selected in the parameter. So this graphic will show employee sales. So what I need is to grab monthly volume and drop it into the columns. Now this metric needs to be changed to an attribute, and I'd like to expand on why some of these metrics need to be changed to attribute and others don't. So basically in my performance data, all of my sales metrics have a single record for a single person in a single month. However, in my earnings, I have multiple earning codes that can exist for a single person in a single month. So when you're joining the data, we have multiple earnings that are coming through in January, for example, but I only have one monthly sales volume number. But Tableau doesn't know how to separate that, so it duplicates it. And I just need to know that fact so that I'm not overstating the sales that each rep is generating. So moving on, the next thing I want to do is grab my monthly volume, drop it into the color. Again, I need to change this to an attribute. And I'm going to change the color scale that is being used on this report. So I'm going to select color, edit colors, hit the drop down, scroll down to temperature diverging. And right now this representation is showing the lower values as green, higher values as red. I want to reverse that, use the full color range, and use an advanced aspect by fixating this color range to 30,000 and 130,000. And the reason for this is I want this standard to apply to all teams, regardless of how well they're performing. I want the same level of green to be associated to the same person, regardless of what team they are on. And then lastly, what I want to do is for this graphic to always be sorted where my top performer is on the bottom, or on the top rather, and the bottom performer is on the bottom. So the way that I do that is this icon up here that says sort employee name descending by monthly volume. By simply clicking this, it will always sort the data in this manner. And then one other thing I forgot to add is a data label. Again, I'm going to format that to only display one decimal place and display it in thousands. So this is our employee graphic, and it gives a great layout for managers to monitor how their employees are performing throughout the month and on an ongoing basis. So the next representation is very similar to the employee sales graphic that we just completed. The only difference is that this one focuses on close rate. So this required a new calculated field, and what close rate is the number of transactions an employee sold in a given month divided by the number of sales opportunities that they had in a given month. So really it's just another way to track employee performance, but more from an efficiency standpoint. So one thing you'll notice is that someone that has a high number of sales generated in a month will typically be at the top of the charts from a close rate standpoint as well. However, something I found interesting is Rondé Barber is the second highest performing sales rep from a close rate standpoint. However, he was the lowest performing sales rep from a revenue generation standpoint. So what this means is that Rondé Barber isn't producing a huge amount of volume, but he is being much more efficient with the opportunities that he's given. And this may warrant Rondé to be provided more opportunities in the future. So one of the formatting items that I haven't covered in any of the representations yet is to remove this employee title name. And one of the ways to go about this is to select the analysis tab, come to table layout, and to uncheck this show field labels for rows. Again, I've kind of reiterating how these labels are not necessary. We're going to have plenty of titles for each of these representations on our dashboard, and I really want to save as much space as possible to show the graphics rather than reiterating the same labels. So the next couple of representations we're going to cover are going to be focused on team ratings, and so those representations will provide insight on how this group of individuals is performing compared to other groups within the same site. So each of the 4 team ranking representations will show 2 items. First, the ranking itself, and then the performance metric value for each team. And the 4 performance metrics we're going to cover is team sales, close rate, VPG, and down payment percentage. Now, VPG is a calculation that is kind of an extension to close rate. What it is it takes the monthly sales volume and divides it by the number of sales opportunities that each team had in a given month. So it really, like I said, it extends on close rate. Close rate is transactions divided by opportunities, and it just gives a little better visibility into the efficiency of each team. So one thing you'll notice is that this representation is very similar to our manager hurdle statistics and our manager earning statistics, meaning we just drop the values into the text, and it just gives us a simple numbered value rather than any kind of graphic. But these rankings are much more involved and more complex to accurately show. First off, each of these representations required 4 calculated fields with the exception to team sales. That first field was the value of the actual performance metric. Obviously, we didn't need that for team sales because we have monthly volume to be that value. The other 3 formulas are related to the ranking itself, and I just kind of quickly want to go through those. The first one is a basic rank formula that assigns a number value 1 through 6 in this case to the monthly sales. Next is an if statement that assigns the proper suffix to the end of each of these numbered values. And then the third one combines those 2, creating a nice formatted ranking number. So before I move on, I want to quickly explain the importance of the team rank, which is our number value 1 through 6. Team rank allows us to apply the temperature palette that we've used in other representations. And I think it's really helpful in this representation as well because it emphasizes where they are in a ranking. Instead of just showing 6, for example, that bright red lets you know you're on the bottom, you need to pick up your pace. Or conversely, when it's bright green, then you know your team's doing really well and you can praise them for that. So moving on to the next thing, probably the most complex item to create this representation is the filtering. You can see we've used match month to be true as we've done in other representations. But a couple of things that are different are first, the employee name filter. What I've done is I've manually gone and selected each of the 6 managers in the list. It's a little different than what we've been doing with the match employee parameter, and I'll get into that in just a second. What we see here is actually an incomplete representation. Remember, we're only showing 1 manager at a time. So my employee parameter is Tony Dungy. I only want Tony Dungy's values to show up and the rest of these to filter away. So if I use match employee and select true, before I hit OK, let's take a note that Tony Dungy is currently in 4th spot. If I hit OK, he now moves to 1st spot. And the reason for that is the match employee parameter or formula removes all the other employees. So there's only 1 spot to have, which would be 1st. So we can't use this formula as we've done in other examples. What we have to do is we have to create a lookup formula. And before I do that, this lookup formula actually requires us to edit our employee parameter. So we have to go to employee parameter, hit edit, and then we're going to add this all criteria at the bottom. And essentially to Tableau, what this means is it's all of the names on the employee list. It kind of groups them into a total all-encompassing parameter. And then when I create my lookup formula, it's going to be a lookup that forces the employee name to either match the parameter or to match the employee parameter all. And once I've done that, all I have to do is drag in my set employee formula, select true, and now we've removed all the other managers, and Tony Dungy's rankings have not been adjusted. Now, it's also important to maintain this employee filter that manually selected those 6 managers. If I remove this, for example, you'll see my ranking drops to 7th. The reason for that is now, because of the employee parameter all, it's looking at the entire list, in which case Tony Dungy just happens to fall 7th on the list. So that's why it's important to leave this filter on, because even though I have the set employee name forced to be all, I'm limiting that all, if you will, to only the 6 managers. So once we have this, we can drag that same field into each of the filters. Now we have Tony Dungy and his rankings on each of the 4 representations. And we can continue with some formatting, removing the titles and whatnot as we've done before. And then we're ready to drag all these representations into our dashboard, which I will move to next. So one of the first things you'll need to do is to select this icon at the bottom to create your new dashboard. The panel will be blank initially, but I've already brought in some of the representations to speed up the process. To drag in a representation, it's fairly simple. You just grab the worksheet name and drag it into the dashboard. Now, before you do that, you want to make sure that this floating icon is selected. It will default to tile. And I just find that the floating option is just easier to work with. It gives me more flexibility in selecting the location of the representation. So next we need to edit titles, either make them more bold or remove them entirely. If we want to edit them, just right click and select edit, and we can make all the changes in this window. If we want to remove them, we're going to select this drop down and deselect the title option. Next we need to fix the fit of this graph or statistic. So by hitting the drop down, I'll go to fit, and instead of standard, I'll select entire view. And then I'll just adjust the box down so that the statistics are not stretched so far apart until I get to a size that I'm happy with. So the next thing we need to address is how we're going to separate each of these graphics. We can create borders for each representation, but I find that's going to make the entire dashboard too busy. So I think a better option is to come to this format, select dashboard, and then we're going to provide a background color. So now that creates a nice border, kind of a natural separation of each representation, and it allows me to join multiple representations to make them look as one block. So that's what I'm going to attempt to do first on the speedometer, excuse me, and the speedometer statistics. I can manually drag this over and try to align this, but I find that's a little bit time consuming and very tedious to align perfectly. So the easier way to do this is to come over to this layout option, and you can see you're given values here for position, X and Y coordinate, and the size by width and height. Now the X and Y coordinate is always referencing the top left corner of the image. So I can use the speedometer as a reference to help align the statistics. So I can see my speedometer is at X value of 185 and a width of 384. So if I come to my statistics and change my X value to 185, now my left side is aligned with the speedometer, and the width of 384 will make it the same exact size. Now all I'm left to do is to essentially drag this straight up. You can play with the height of the Y coordinate of the image, but I think at this point it's probably easier to just manually drag up, and if we've lost that X coordinate, then we could fix it fairly quickly. So now you can see what that does is it makes this entire block look as one image rather than two separate representations. And I think it creates a much cleaner look for this for the dashboard. So the next things we want to bring over is this speedometer hurdle achieved value, and then also the speedometer ring. Now this image I haven't covered yet, but it's essentially just a half circle with a white fill. Whatever, you can do this in a basic paint program or Excel or anywhere you can create a circle with a fill, and then you can just save that image as a PNG. Sometimes if you save as other file types, the white background will actually go away, and that's important to keep for this image because we want it to cover the speedometer. We don't want the background to go away. But the way we bring this in is if I switch back over to dashboard, and under objects I double click on image, and you can browse to the image and bring it in from there. So the next thing I want to do is just to drag these images over and try to align them till I'm satisfied. But I can see I have an issue here. The speedometer circle is covering my number. So the reason for that is we're using floating objects. So there is an order of the floating objects that will put an image in front of another. So what I need to do is select my hurdle achieved, and on my drop down move to floating order, and then select bring to the front. This will now bring my hurdle achieved in front of the ring so that it's visible in the speedometer. So now all I need to do is to drag this over. It's okay if a little bit of the speedometer is showing because my 2 is going to cover that. And that's pretty much it. Now my speedometer is done. It looks nice and clean, and I've brought in 4 separate images and made them appear as one image. So as you can see, I've jumped ahead in my demonstration. I've brought in basically all of my representations and aligned them. And the reason why I skipped the demonstration is basically each representation required the same steps that I covered in the speedometer. And most of the cases were actually easier than the speedometer because for the employee close rate, for example, was one block of image in itself. So all it required was some minor formatting and editing the title, whereas the speedometer required me to merge multiple images and to make it appear as one. So moving on to the last couple of items is I want a dashboard title and then an overall title for my manager rankings. So starting with the rankings portion, I can move over to my objects area, double click on text, and I can type in my title. And then I'm just going to apply some standard formatting that I've been using throughout the dashboard. And that creates a text for my title. Now, one thing you'll notice is that the white background that is used throughout the dashboard is not there for my title. So I can fix that by coming over to layout and under background selecting the white option instead of none. Now, the next thing I need to do is I want to expand and place my title so that it fits more within the layout of the dashboard. In my opinion, the easiest way to do this is by using my position and size numbers of the other representations that are already aligned to make this a little easier. So first off, I know that I want my title to start at the same point as my ranking from the left side. So the way I would look at that is this value of 591 needs to also be the same for my title. Now, I also want the width to stretch across both of these. So the easiest way to get that value is to select on my employee monthly sales. I see a width of 395 and changing my width accordingly. Next is I want this top of the title to be in line with my speedometer, and I can see the Y value of the speedometer is 95, so I will change that. And that leaves me with my height. Now, I have used a spacing between each of these representations of 5 units. So I want to maintain that same space for the title. The way I do this is taking the difference between the Y points for the title and the representation. And what I mean by that is you can use this as a mathematical equation. 95 plus 30 is 125, meaning my title ends at the Y value of 125. My monthly sales rankings starts at a value of 135, so that's a gap of 10 units. And the easiest way to bridge this gap is to just increase my height by 5 units, and that will effectively maintain the same distance that I've been using throughout this section of my dashboard. The last piece is I want to create a title for my dashboard. So I would come over to Dashboard, select Show Title. Now it's going to start off as a tiled image. I want to change this to floating, but before I do that, I want to take a note of these 3 values so that I can quickly shift it back to this location. I just don't want it to be attached to the entire length of the dashboard. So I hit floating. My values were 8 for both X and Y and a height of 42. Now the width is a little more complicated. Basically, I want my width to come to an end at the employee parameter. So I need my width to basically be a mathematical equation to 640. And what I mean by that is I'm going to come over here. I have 8 as my value of X. And so that means I want my width to be 632. And you can see that brings it to the end of the parameter. Now all that's left to do is to give a little more formal title, which is Sales Manager Dashboard. Let's make this bold, center it, and that's it. My dashboard's done. Everything is in a nice, neat format, and I have enabled all the representations to be driven off of just 2 parameters so that each representation updates with a single selection of either parameter. So I hope you've enjoyed this demonstration. It's been a huge learning process for me. I really didn't have much experience in Tableau before this class, and I really enjoyed figuring out how to create each of these demonstrations, and I think it's a great tool to learn. Thank you.